A few days ago, I was asked a question on the channel about Fantasy Flight Games, Star Wars role-playing. And the question was about mass combat. And as we look, down through the history of role-playing, we can see that there have been a lot of different solutions to that problem. How can I abstract a very large-scale combat in a way that is still satisfying, in a way that still feels like the game that we're playing? And not all games have been successful. They've either abstracted it to the point where it's simplified and isn't very satisfying, or it's gone off in a completely different direction where it's basically asking you to learn a different game and to play the game that you're playing differently in order to have this one scene, this mass battle scene. Well, Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars role-playing came up with a solution that I personally found to be quite satisfying, as it does not diverge from the standard mechanics of the game. It doesn't ask you to do anything differently. And it's set up just like all the other roles in the game. It's set up to provide you with prompts from which you can improvise and describe and match those results to the specific situation that your game or the characters are in. So I consider it to be quite successful. And when I used it in campaign play, it was also a lot of fun. So that's a bonus. So what does it actually ask you to do? As usual, I'm going to say the best way to understand what it asks you to do is to actually read it. And you have two locations where you can see it. You can find the base rules on a page and a half in an adventure module called Onslaught at Arda 1 for Age of Rebellion. You can find the full rules with all the little pieces that will help you build a mass combat of whatever type you can envision in the Star Wars galaxy. You can find that in the career sourcebook for commanders for Age of Rebellion called Lead by Example. It's here. Now, it occupies a small section of the text from page 70 to page 77. And the last two pages are an example of using the system full out. So once you've read through it, it should not present any problems because it's not asking you to do anything differently. But that's on the system side. The methodology side may give some people trouble, especially if they've never considered trying something like a mass combat. But Star Wars has a lot of scenes of space conflict or of ground-based conflict that is far more than the scope of just your characters. And so, the films are pushing us a little bit to expand our envelope, and this system is there to help us do that. So, how does it work? First, you're going to build a pool. You're going to use your ability dice to represent one side of the conflict, and you're going to use the difficulty dice to represent the other side of the conflict. And depending on the actual situation that you want to employ this mechanic in, you will upgrade or downgrade dice, you'll add boost dice, you'll add setback dice as needed. And there is guidance provided for that, but your own intuition is going to match that. Is this a situation where I should upgrade, these conditions like rain or fighting uphill or whatever, should apply boost dice or should apply setback dice and so on and so forth. So just like any other combat scene in the game, you'll build the pool. And that's really all there is from the mechanics. But how do we determine what those pools should be? First off, we're going to start with a comparison of the forces. Right? So it arranges it in a 6-tier system, starting with trivial and ending up with overwhelming. Right? So we've got trivial, 1 green die, significant, imposing, staggering, vast, and overwhelming. And you're not expected to memorize these things, and you're not expected to automatically intuit that overwhelming is a larger force than staggering. But it provides guidance, and this is the simple label for that guidance in identifying if it makes sense to reasonably consider one of the sides involved as being a trivial force or an imposing force or an overwhelming force and that sort of stuff, so that you can very quickly determine how many dice to assign to each side. So that's it. You're done. Right? So what would be an example of a trivial force? We can find the answer to that on page 71 in table 3.1, force strength. And it's in two columns, planetary forces and starship forces, to make it even easier. There's also a sidebar on this page about combined arms saying, feel free to mix and match different unit types, because that's what Star Wars shows us over and over and over again. Right. So we're looking at the overwhelming categorization of a side. We're not saying, well, their fighters are weaker, and so that's trivial, but their capital ships are stronger, so that it's not like that. The whole side. So a trivial force might be multiple rebel cells working together on a planetary thing, or a squadron of speeders or recon walkers, a platoon of Imperial Army troopers. This is a trivial force. Not much bigger than a group of PCs, really. Compare that to imposing an army of several dozen Gungans, right? A platoon of Rebel Marines or Imperial Stormtroopers, a dozen Wookiee warriors, a squadron of hover tanks or heavy walkers. On the starship side, for imposing, we have multiple wings of starfighters, a small fleet of gunships, a single cruiser, this kind of stuff. So you can very quickly scan down the list and say, okay, this side is an imposing force, that side is a significant force, done. And now you know the distribution of ability dice and difficulty dice. Okay, then setback and boost dice. What would be an example reason to add? Table 3.3 gives us some examples that we can use as inspiration and guidance for determining the use of these dice, such as the acting force has non-combatant allies who provide useful support or other supplies, offering their knowledge of the battle site to the acting force, and offering supplies, offering spotters. That is worth a boost die. Right? So it's very logical. It's very simple. Weather or stellar phenomena get in the way, right, of one of the forces. On which side are we rolling? This will be a boost die or a setback die. Right? So pretty straightforward. Then after you've rolled, you will, of course, have to assign meaning to advantages and threat and despair and triumph. Well, one advantage might be all the characters can recover one strain. That should seem pretty familiar, right? So things are going well on that roll. So people feel bolstered. They get some strain back. Two advantages. The PCs perform a particularly heroic act or do something with minor but lasting consequences for the cause of the Rebel Alliance. All right, so that's very specific. Two advantages, and that could determine that the PCs have done something specific, and we'll come back to this idea in a minute. There's also outcomes where NPCs do something of consequence or develop in some way, like a leader that is associated with the PCs but is not among them, is not a PC, begins to rise up and gain some attention, like a Saw Gerrera character, or recognizing the value of Lando Calrissian to the Rebel Alliance and this sort of thing, right? They do something to distinguish themselves and everyone goes, aha, that's pretty fantastic. What about a triumph? A single triumph. A notable NPC within the acting force performs a particular feat of heroism, which is what I was just talking about, or reinforcements arrive to support the acting force. These increase the force strength of the acting force by 1 step. Okay, so that is pretty heavy. And it's talking about in future phases. It will increase the value of that force from, imposing, or from insignificant to imposing, for example, on the next phase. And that's the next detail that I want to talk about. We can, but we're not really going to approach this as just one roll. If the thing is going to happen in the background, if it's relatively small, if it's something that in its complete state is going to influence play, then sure, you might want to boil it all down into one roll and see what happens. But if this is a battle that the PCs are going to be involved in, which is pretty much the only reason to invoke the system from many people's point of view, if they're going to be involved in it, then we're looking for the points where that involvement will be interesting. So we might simply organize it as we're going to roll for the beginning stages of the battle, the midpoint of the battle, and the end point of the battle, right? And each of the preceding rolls is going to influence the subsequent rolls. And the interesting turns of getting these narrative results, such as despair and triumph, and these will signal to us that this could be a great spot to interpret as a place where the PCs were active and doing something. So, to rephrase that, we're going to break our mass combats into multiple stages, rolling each time, allowing the effects of previous rolls to influence the setup and the outcome of subsequent rolls. And we are looking for the things in the mass combat that people will talk about afterward. We're looking for the heroic moments of NPCs, and we're looking for the opportunities for the PCs to act. So once you've rolled through all of these stages, you have built the framework of a mass battle. You've looked at a potential for how things are going to go. And this is like doing your preparation. You're preparing to build on this for the session in which the mass combat happens. So you can either do this at the table, live, which I've done, which was fun, or you can do it before play and just take notes of the outcomes, and when that battle eventually comes up, either just on the news or because the player characters are actually there setting it off, or rushing to join in to help, or whatever, then you're all set to go. Now these results that you've taken are not at this point set in stone. You have identified particular turning points in the battle that are going to matter. And now we find out how the player characters and their involvement with this battle mattered. So that's kind of cool. And that's really all there is to it. The idea is not to present some complete scene where the game master is the only person talking and the PCs are expected just to listen and go, ooh, cool. Right? You're not the entertainer. You're not painting the movie with your words. The idea is that with these details that you've generated, you now have the inspiration, you have the prompts, you have the details in order to be able to very quickly present these vistas that will operate through different zoom levels. We'll start out maybe with an awareness of the whole battle, and then we're going to quickly zoom in over here where two PCs maybe are serving as wingmen in X-Wings, and they're dealing with TIE fighters. But we know that an NPC makes a heroic sacrifice, and so we've got over here a description of how one of the NPC rebel fighter pilots has pulled away a small squadron of TIE fighters that were guarding a cruiser, which lets the other PCs who are in Y-Wings do a bombing run down the cruiser. We're zooming out to see the whole battle. We're zooming in to see the X-Wings. We're zooming out to see the TIE fighters being lured away, and then we're zooming in to see the Y-Wings coming in for their bombing run. And so we're moving out to description, and we're moving in to actual play. So we have context, and then we have conflict, in and out over the various stages of the mass combat. This could be just a few rolls, like 3 or 4 of these mass combat rolls to talk about one space battle, like in Rogue One, let's say, over a planet. Or this might be something like, one of the most enjoyable examples I have is of our 8-day rebellion. You can hear about it in the recaps in this playlist. But we did several rolls for each day, and the conflict slowly spread across the planet, and reinforcements were slowly delivered of different types. And over the course of 8 days, the Imperial forces and the rebel forces of this planet clashed, collided, and ultimately the rebels lost. So that set up the Rebel Alliance to have to make some very difficult decisions. So this is the kind of stuff that we're talking about. These are the uses to which mass combat is put. It's very simple to use. It's a lot easier if you have it in print to see how these ideas were organized and then learn to operate from the charts as though they are just suggestions, just like every other chart in the game. And that's it. So I hope this has been helpful, and I'll talk to you soon.